Amy, but Lyndon should have this one on for this. Can you hear me?
That mic, Barbara, is better.
Okay.
Okay, we need two mics.
It's 12:30 on the nose. Let's go. I want to welcome you all to the Independent Women's Forum speaker series, monthly speaker series. And our speaker this month is David Horowitz, an old and dear friend of ours. Before I introduce David to you, I want to just clear up a few incidentals about housekeeping for the Independent Women's Forum, which is always a challenge. Next Wednesday evening at 7:30 at the Mayflower Hotel, we are helping organize a dinner in honor of Ward Connerly, the chairman of the California Civil Rights Initiative. We are down to eight more places are left. So if you wish to sign up for that dinner, please speak with me afterwards, and we'll be glad to process that. The other event that we're going to be holding in February at the National Press Club on February 20th is a day-long symposium on women's health, law, and the junking of science. So far, we have 4 panels on one on contraception, another on breast silicone implants, another on the impact of feminist theory on science. Mona Charon will be chairing the final panel. And at this moment, of course, we have not heard whether the FDA or Health and Human Services will be represented, though they've been invited. So now to David. In his new autobiography, Radical Son, A Generational Odyssey, my copy of which I left downstairs because it's dog-eared and has notes all over it, David explains how, as we used to say in the 60s, the personal is political. This powerful and compelling masterpiece entwines the history of our generation with David's history as the son of American communists. As a key ideologue of the New Left, in David's book, he peels off layer by painful layer of his, or rather I should say our, self-delusions and illusions, exposing the truth and consequences of our willful blindness. Slowly, life snapshot by life snapshot, he removed his blinders, proving that he was tough enough and honest enough to look behind him and see anew. This he's able to do because David is consistent. I know moving from new left to new right may not seem consistent, but it is. It's consistent in that what propelled him to action in the beginning and what continues to propel him now is the same. As he wrote in this profound book, socialism was the desire for justice. I did not see how I could give that up. He hasn't really. That search for justice has merely been transformed. The journey from the idea that socialism equals justice to today's revival of the principle of a single standard for all in a free market democratic system is the unifying theme of David's life and David's book. And to tell us about that journey is David Horowitz.
Thank you, Barbara. I want to thank the Independent Women's Forum and my dear old friend, Barbara, for inviting me here. Barbara, as you know, is a political movement all by herself. Kierkegaard said that the tragedy of life is that we are condemned to live it forwards and understand it backwards. And that makes writing an autobiography a special privilege. For those of us who have the privilege, we get, for the first time in our lives, to look like we knew what we were doing. It's also an opportunity to embarrass yourself. And I have taken full advantage of that opportunity in Radical Son. And part of that was deliberate. I embarrass a lot of people in this book, and I felt that for the book to have credibility, I would have to be as hard on myself as on others. And it's also, it's a question of, this is a very old-fashioned word, but the truth, about being candid about what we did and what its consequences were. And I think that is what kind of divides me from my former comrades who are still on the left. Before getting to those embarrassments, I should probably answer the question which Barbara partly did. as to the continuity, as to how does somebody who was brought up by American communists and was a founder of the radical movement in the 60s wind up voting for Ronald Reagan and identifying with conservatives today? And so let me say that I still believe, as I did then, in the liberation of poor people and black Americans and other minorities. Only today, I believe they need to be liberated from the chains of liberalism and the welfare state, which has destroyed their families, eroded the moral fabric of their communities, and which endorses today a state-sponsored, government-provided discrimination, a system of racial preferences, which reminds me very much of what we fought against in the South in the 1960s. I was brought up by American communists, and there is a large industry in our universities today by members of the left who are still carrying on their dishonest work, which claims that American communism was just another American radical movement. And I am here to tell you, and there are thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who could also tell you from firsthand experience, that the American Communist movement, the movement that my parents and all of our friends belonged to, was a vast conspiracy directed by the Kremlin, financed by the Kremlin, and that very ordinary people in their hearts were loyal to the Soviet Union and its empire, to Joseph Stalin, the biggest mass murderer in human history. Very decent people otherwise committed themselves this way and were prepared to betray America and to spy if necessary. One of the stories that I tell in Radical Son is of a friend of the family, the mother of my closest friend, who was a high school teacher, about 4'11", probably never broke a law in her life, never littered, but was a member of the Communist Party, and one day was given a sealed envelope to take to Mexico on a party mission, no questions to be asked or asked. And she did. And inside that envelope was a letter that was part of a chain that linked the butcher in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin, to an agent in Mexico who put an ice pick in Leon Trotsky's head. So even people who would seem, and in their own eyes would be innocent and well-meaning, if you met my parents, they would have called themselves progressives. They were members of the Democratic Party, except in 1948 they supported the candidacy of Henry Wallace, the Progressive Party, which was controlled by the Communist Party, and in which George McGovern earned his political eye teeth. That was his first campaign, campaigning for Henry Wallace. So in that way, and in the way that will unfold in reading Radical Son, this sort of strange fringe movement of American life really moved to the very center of American politics. This year, Alger Hiss died, again as a credit to the work that the left has done in teaching our children. I have interviewed many young people who have never heard of Whittaker Chambers, who was the hero who accused Hiss and exposed him as a spy at the top of American government, an advisor to Roosevelt at Yalta, which is where the post-war world was divided and what caused the Cold War, that division. They remember, they have no knowledge of who Whittaker Chambers was, but Alger Hiss they remember as a victim of McCarthyism. So the traitor is remembered as a hero, the hero is forgotten, and this is because our perception of American communism is of some benignly misguided, estranged people, the way I guess we regard the 16,000 Marxists on our faculties in America today. This is a mistake, and the story I tell in Radical Son shows why. In 1959, 1960, the New Left was formed. This, too, has been misrepresented by Todd Gitlin, Tom Hayden, and other writers about the 60s as a movement of idealists who became radicalized because of the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the Vietnam War. The reality is that the New Left was formed by red diaper babies like myself. Tom Hayden learned his politics from the children of the communist left, that our enterprise as New Leftists was to resurrect the communist movement without the stigma of Joseph Stalin. That's why we called ourselves New Leftists. That's why we rejected excluding communists from our ranks. And of course, by the end of the 60s decade, the New Left had embraced Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and other leaders of the communist world movement. And there was a famous, or perhaps infamous, Harvard SDS convention where the two sides of SDS, being the Students for Democratic Society, a 100,000 member organization of the New Left in the 60s, and one side chanting in favor of Chairman Mao, who we now know killed 30 million people in a politically induced famine in the late 1950s, and the other side chanting for Ho Chi Minh. Many of us, like my parents, collaborated with the enemy. I was approached in a story that I tell in Radical Sun by the KGB when I was in London. A KGB officer took me to lunch. I was, I would say, quite naive because I spent a lot of those lunches being a New Leftist, trying to tell the Russian how they could, better conduct the political struggle by, for example, freeing their dissidents from prisons. And then one day came when he asked me to spy. I was teaching on the NATO bases, and I, told him to get lost. But I saw this KGB agent with lots of my friends, and nobody ever discussed it. And nobody, to my knowledge, has written, as I have, about their encounters with the KGB. And how many people collaborated, I don't know. Tom Hayden, with an SDS delegation, went to Czechoslovakia, met with the communists, the Vietnamese communists, and advised them in how to conduct psychological warfare against the United States in 1968. Tom Hayden is a Democratic state senator from the state of California and is currently running for mayor of Los Angeles. He's written a 450-page memoir, but you will not find this story in it, nor will you find the story of Tom Hayden's other collaborations with the Vietnamese communists. He did go to Hanoi. He met with them in Paris. He wrote psychological warfare pieces in which I published in Ramparts. As I say, this is a book that's filled with embarrassments for me, but it's time for Tom Hayden also to embarrass himself. And instead, what he does in his book is he intersperses accounts of his political activities, which are very innocent, with his FBI dossier. So that makes the FBI look both malign and ineffectual at the same time. I mean, why is the FBI looking at Tom Hayden if his activities are just protests in the streets? Well, if you accept the New Left and now the liberal version of America's recent history, it's because the FBI was a malicious organization, and people like Joe McCarthy and the FBI were much greater threats than the traitors whom they were trying to unearth and expose. But the reality is that Tom Hayden committed treason, as Jane Fonda did, and this will not make me very popular, of course, to say so, but that is the reality, as I did. And I describe in this, in Radical Sun, how Peter Collier and I and the other editors of Ramparts were approached by a defector from the National Security Agency, which is our electronic intelligence agency. Now there are books on the NSA, but then it was completely unknown. and how we first considered, should we publish this man's story? And what was in his story, the key item was that the fact that the United States, or his claim, the United States had broken the Soviet code. Those of you who see James Bond movies or other or read spy novels will know that this is this is the most consequential information you can have, because once the other side discovers that you know their code, they change the code. So I had no idea that this is what was involved. I have to say, in my mind, we were revealing that there could be no surprise attacks, because we knew where all the Soviet planes were. We could listen to the messages between them. This officer had listened to the conversation between Kosygin and the Soviet astronaut who burned up in space. Anyway, while we were considering whether to publish this, we wanted to know what our liability was. We had children, families. So I called the Ellsberg defense team and talked to Charles Nesson, who is still today, is a Harvard professor then. He's a Harvard law professor now, one of the most distinguished, I guess, constitutional experts in the country. And he said, yes, you will be violating the Espionage Act. It was written in 1918. And then he added, however, the act was written in a peculiar way, so that there has to be a document for them to convict you. Remember Ellsberg, when he was being tried for the Pentagon Papers, he had Xeroxed documents and brought them out. That's the way the law is written. So he said, if you just deny that there's any documents, that will protect you. Furthermore, we live in a democracy, and therefore the government is going to have to prove in a court of law that you damage national security. And therefore the government is going to have to reveal, in order to convict you, way more than it wants anybody to know. And therefore you have a good chance of getting off. Well, that was enough for us. That was enough for us. Now I would like, and since this is on television, I would like Charles Nesson to fess up at this point. This is now 30 years later. Let us have a candid look at the past, the way I have attempted to do in Radical Son, so that we can reassess what the FBI was doing in those days, so that we can reassess what the Nixon administration may have feared in those days, and not treat it as some kind of laughable excess of right-wing paranoia. Probably the thing that will upset, that I say most people, is my view of the anti-so-called war movement. Of course, a lot of us were never even thought of ourselves as being anti-war, although we wrote the slogans. The slogan of the anti-war movement was, bring the troops home, which meant the communists would win. Everybody who marched behind a slogan, bring the troops home, knew the communists would win and considered that the lesser of two evils. What struck me, and as I report in the book, is that in 1970-71, all the demonstrations suddenly disappeared. In 1970, there were 1 million people in the streets. The universities, 80% of the universities were closed down. In 1971, there was one demonstration in Washington with 30,000 people, and that was it. And then for the next 4 years, there was nothing. The war went on for 4 more years. Where were all these people who said they cared about the Vietnamese? Where were all these people who said they thought the war was immoral? The reality is they went home. And why? Because Richard Nixon made very clear in 1970 that there was no longer going to be a draft. That was it. The anti-war movement was an anti-draft movement by middle-class, privileged young people who did not want to risk their lives for America, who did not want to risk their lives in a war against communism. That is the reality. Everything else is just so much rhetoric. The question that people always ask me is that what turned me around? And in this story, the core of Radical Son is the story of my turnaround. And I explore both the events and also internally what happened to me and how I rethought everything that I had ever believed. In 1973, I was introduced to the Black Panther leader Huey P. Newton in his Oakland penthouse apartment. I had avoided the Panthers during the 60s because they were violent and militaristic. I was a kind of classical Marxist, if you like. I believed the revolution had to come from a majority. It couldn't come from adventurist or radical groups that were armed. And one of the more amusing moments, I guess, in the book, I describe how Michael Lerner, who has become, or became for his 15 minutes of fame, Hillary Clinton's guru, advised me to purchase a gun. You know, I told him I couldn't see a situation in which we would win. You know, it wasn't that I was against guns, but it seemed to me obvious. And he said, well, then you have to buy a handgun for use in assassinations. And I said, you know, where is this movement going? So when I got involved with Huey Newton, I was not thinking revolution. Huey had come out of prison and said it's time to put away the gun and time to serve the people. Murray Kempton was writing front page review of Huey Newton's autobiography in 1973, front page of the Sunday New York Times book review, and in which he compared Huey Newton to Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther. That was the attitude. Gary Wills wrote a similar piece in the New York Times about the Panther 21, a group which had killed a black and white police team and blew up various facilities. And at one point machine gunned a police car. And Gary Wills wrote that these were innocents and it was the system that was guilty. So I got involved and I raised about $100,000 and bought a church in the heart of the inner city, which was used as a school. I named it the Oakland Community Learning Center, and I hired the bookkeeper, a woman, a mother of 3 children who had kept the books for me at Ramparts. And in 1974, Betty Van Patter was murdered by the Black Panther Party. And I discovered not only that they were gangsters, but the police were paralyzed. The press was uninterested. And the reality was that the left had so reshaped American culture that it was almost impossible to convict a black murderer of, in this case, of a white woman, but most of the murders were committed against other black people, provided the black murderer positioned himself either as a champion of the oppressed, or his lawyers, when they went into court, because Huey Newton had been into court several times for murdering a policeman by this time, if his defense attorneys would present him as a victim of police brutality, racist police repression, and racist America. You may recognize this defense. Well, Johnny Cochran took this defense from Charles Gary and William Kunstler, the architects of it, to get O.J. Simpson off. And I mean, it's one of the most hard, you know, Huey Newton actually used to pick white juries because the white juries would not understand, as I didn't understand, that he was a street thug and a hustler. And they would believe his story about having learned to read by reading Plato in high school, which they did regularly. The real liberal racism, I would say, is probably the most significant problem we have in this country. It's a patronizing attitude towards minorities, that they can't live up to the same moral standards as the rest of us. Endless excuses made, and a total double standard in dealing with their excesses. Peter Jennings the other night had up on the TV screen, you know, the jury, white, 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 white. You didn't see that after the first trial, black, 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 black. There probably aren't 2 people in America, maybe there are 2, who know that Ollie North was convicted by a black jury, that his jury was black. He was tried in the District of Columbia. There was no TV on the jury in the Yanko Rosenbaum case when a black mob lynched an Australian saying, "Kill the Jew, kill the Jew." They caught the perpetrator with the murder weapon, with the blood of the victim on him. He confessed, and he was acquitted by a jury composed of blacks and Puerto Ricans. Every night on the evening news, you see an incitement against white America, as though white America has nothing better to do than to think about how to keep black America down. This is a wind we are sowing, which is going to become, already has become a whirlwind in Los Angeles, where our town was burned down a few years ago. The experience with the Black Panther Party made me realize that everybody around me was a danger to me. If I told anybody that I thought even, I told the daughter of the woman who was murdered, and she did not believe me that it was the Black Panthers. Because, what she said to me is they're good people. It took her years to adjust to the fact, to come around to the fact that, yes, these people whom all of us, from Tom Hayden, who has never said a word on this subject, to the New York Times, which continues to celebrate, and the Washington Post, which only a month ago did a story on the legend of the Black Panthers, to understand that if I were to say, or that the Black Panther Party is a bunch of murderers, or murdered this woman even, I would be looked on as a racist, and it would not be believed. Which is almost the state it is today. I think that things are beginning to change. Ironically, the O.J. Simpson trial, I think, makes the stories I have to tell in this book much more credible. You may remember that at Yale University was shut down because of a trial of Black Panthers leaders, including Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins, who were accused of torturing and murdering a Black Panther named Alex Rackley. Nobody denied that they tortured him. They poured boiling water on his chest. But the president of Yale University, Kingman Brewster, led a demonstration, and Tom Hayden was there, and all the other Kunstler, all the other leaders of the left. And Kingman Brewster said, a black revolutionary cannot get a fair trial in America. Well, that was true if the black revolutionary was named Alex Rackley. His murderers would go free. Why? Because they are the darlings of the liberal culture that we have developed in this country, and of the amnesia, the liberal culture which lives off the amnesia it has about all these events. I just want to add to this one other thing, because not only did the Black Panthers continue in Oakland, building their little empire on the Oakland Community Learning Center that I had created, but their leader, Elaine Brown, when she ran for office in the midst of, right after Betty was murdered, she had the endorsement of the Trades Union Council. She had the endorsement of the Democratic Party, of Ron Dellums and all the Democratic leaders there. And her council, the party council, and J. Anthony Klein, who is today a Superior Court judge in California, whereas in the 70s, mind you, he was getting her thugs out of jail. That was his business. He was the appointment secretary for the governor of the state of California, which meant that he appointed all the judges. So Huey Newton, who is by now in Cuba, having fled after murdering a prostitute, an 18-year-old, decided he could come back to California. He had a chance, to beat the rap because he had friendly judges. That is the state that we came to in this country in this period. It was much easier for me to understand that the left was a menace, and that the left was not the friend of black people and not the friend of the poor, but a danger to them. That was easier for me than to cross that huge chasm in the middle of our political culture and actually punch the ticket, as I did in 1984 for Ronald Reagan. It took me about 7 years to work through all the issues involved in what it means to view the world as a, quote, progressive. I always have to laugh at the term progressive because Basically, these people are operating on 19th century doctrines of Karl Marx. They don't seem to understand that communism is dead, and that it showed itself to be utterly, economically, as well as politically and socially bankrupt. I still hear from the halls of Congress proposals to redistribute income as though that's going to help anybody, and attacks on the wealthy, which means on the productive people in our society. Would anybody rather see David Bonyer spending Bill Gates's millions than Bill Gates investing them in some part of the economy and creating jobs for people? I think not. But Mr. Bonyer, who supported the communist government in Nicaragua and the El Salvadorian rebels, did everything he could to thwart Oliver North and the Reagan administration from fighting the Cold War in Central America, and is now the whip in the House. I call Bonyer there's a phrase we had in the left, called him a Gucci Marxist. Why? Because he has a $4 million pension, thanks to all you taxpayers, while he attacks tax breaks for the wealthy. I mean, this makes a lot of sense, but this is our politics today. It took me many years to rethink my presumptions, and I have tried. It was a very complicated process because I had grown up. My parents being communists, it was an unspoken condition of their parental love, as it would be in any household, to adopt their values and their outlook. Anyway, sometime in the early 80s, my eyes were opened to the dangers of the left. One story I tell in here is of that process is that Peter Collier and I did an early story on AIDS, and it was clear to me, first of all, the leaders of the gay community were all people who had come from the left. The gay liberation movement defined itself in the terms of the left, and that meant that it wanted to protect promiscuous sex publicly conducted in the bathhouses and so forth. The gay leadership in the early 80s was denying, and I debated gay leaders up and down the state, that AIDS was sexually transmitted. They managed to subvert the public health system, so there has never been AIDS education in this country. You never see the words promiscuous anal sex, which is 100% the cause of sexually transmitted AIDS among males, who constitute a huge proportion of the afflicted community. There has never been contact tracing. There's no testing. None of the health measures, the public health measures that have been used to fight epidemics in the past, have been used on AIDS. I knew in 1983, because you could calculate, and I did calculate then, that a dozen years later there would be 200,000 and 300,000 people dead from AIDS, as there are. I hold, just as I hold the 2.5 million lives that the communists slaughtered in Southeast Asia after the United States withdrew and lost the war, that is on the head, and that of the left, that is the responsibility of the left. So the 200,000 people who have died from AIDS, young gay men, have died needlessly because the public health system in this country was corrupted and subverted and prevented from doing its job. And I interviewed Don Francis, who was a hero of Randy Schilt's film, and the band played on. And Randy, by the way, was a friend and somebody who introduced me to this story. And I asked him, I said, you knew in the 1970s that there was he said there was one big epidemic after another sweeping through the gay community. I said, first of all, how do you at the public health system, he's at the Center for Disease Control, how do you define a big epidemic? He said, oh, it's when it costs the taxpayers $1 million a day. I said, you knew that you had a series of big epidemics running through the gay community in San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles in the 1970s? Why didn't you do something about it? There were no warnings in the bathhouses, let alone closing them. When I was a youngster, we had a polio epidemic they shut down the public swimming pools because that's the way you got it. You didn't go to the theaters. Why didn't you close these bathhouses? He said, oh, because that would be interfering with an alternative lifestyle. In other words, the liberals, the left, the Democratic Party has so intimidated and so converted, if you will, our public health officials to the politically correct view that we shouldn't mention the fact that AIDS is caused by promiscuous anal sex. We shouldn't mention that. We shouldn't involve ourselves in this liberated zone that the gay liberation movement has created, that they were willing to sacrifice the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. That convinced me that the left is a menace to public health, to our health, and you know, at the health of our society in all its senses. And that's why in 1984, I became a conservative. And of course, I voted for Ronald Reagan because of the war in Central America. And the war in Central America seemed to be pretty clear. The Sandinistas said they wanted to create Cuba in Nicaragua. Cuba was a Soviet base, a national prison. I had made that mistake 30 years ago. I wasn't about to make it, or 25 years ago then. I wasn't about to make it again. And I voted for Ronald Reagan. The result was that Peter Collier and I, by this time, were best-selling authors. We had written best-selling biographies of the Rockefellers and the Kennedys. And at this moment, when we voted for Ronald Reagan, and worse yet, admitted that we had done so, was the end, in some sense, of our literary career. We had always been front-page New York Times, Sunday New York Times reviews, rave reviews for our books. After voting for Ronald Reagan, we were relegated to page 19 and a dismissive review. I want to say this does not extend to Christopher Lamenhaupt, the Times Daily reviewer, who called that book that was relegated to page 19 and dismissed an irresistible epic and our best work to date. I don't want to give the impression that I think there's some kind of conspiracy out there. I leave that to Michael Lind. But our careers were severely damaged. I mean, I watch all of my people who were in the left with me, and they give the graduation addresses at universities, which they control, and you know, get the honorary professorships without degrees, and have the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation behind them, all the while complaining about all those right-wing foundations, which are about a tenth the size. And I don't begrudge this. I am a much happier man today than I was as a leftist. Bob Terrell of the American Spectator once said to me, I mean, what a terrible thing it is to be a leftist. You get up every morning in the greatest, happiest country on earth, angry. And you also get up embarrassed. I mean, my book is just a small embarrassment on the route to these gigantic embarrassments the left has. Think of all those people who spent, who spent the last 30 years thinking the Rosenbergs were innocent, and the awful, the demons of, Roy Cohn and Judge Kaufman unjustly convicted them. How do they feel now to discover the Rosenbergs were guilty and were spies, that Alger Hiss was a spy, or to see, the day of I had days of euphoria, let me say, at the end of the 80s when the Soviet Empire fell. See all those people in Eastern Europe cheering on Ronald Reagan, their hero. See the Russians returning the land to the peasants. It was just a wonderful, wonderful time to be alive. Peter and I, in another story I tell in Radical Sun, along with Ron Radosh, who's here today and who wrote the definitive book on the Rosenbergs and has many, many scars to show for it from his colleagues in the history profession. Not because anything he said was wrong, because it's all been vindicated. Every last word of it has been vindicated by the publication of the Venona transcripts and the opening of the Soviet archives. But that doesn't mean that Ron is going to be welcomed back into the, into the Parthenon at the American Historical Association, because these people are unreconstructed leftists who still hate this country and still mean to do it harm. I came into the right not knowing, where I had landed, as it were. I mean, I voted for Ronald Reagan because he was going to prevent Nicaragua from becoming another Cuba, which he did, and which Oliver North did. But I didn't know who I had sort of landed amongst. And one kind of amusing story in the book, Peter Collier and I found ourselves in the green room with Bill Buckley, and we kind of and it's a little room. It was at the it was at the Today Show or something like that. It was at the Today Show. It's a little room, and there was a kind of silence there, and we didn't know it, but Buckley didn't know what to say to us because his son had just reviewed a Kennedy book, which he thought was ours but wasn't, very badly, and had attacked it. And he, being a gentleman and in an aristocratic sort of way, with a civilized manners, he didn't know what to say. And we didn't know, is this a fascist? Is this man a racist? It was only, and so Peter broke the ice by saying, my mother is a great fan of yours. Peter's mother had been a Goldwater Republican. And it was only afterwards that I read John Judas's book about Buckley, John Judas being a thoughtful person who still sees himself generally on the left. And it showed that Buckley was a maverick, a champion of, let me say, a scourge of bigots in the right, a scourge of anti-Semites who had been in the right. And I was introduced this way, to a movement that I didn't even know existed. The room on the conservative side of the spectrum is expansive. It is much larger than on the left. I remember the day when Oliver North was testifying and was the absolute hero of the American right at that moment, and Bill Sapphire, another conservative, wrote a column in the New York Times saying Oliver North should be in jail. And I waited for the attacks to come on Sapphire, and they never came. And there was no way that anybody in the left could attack an icon of the left without, at that moment, becoming ostracized and ending their career in the left, whatever they thought about anything else. And so I realized I had come into a very large and differentiated movement, a large spectrum of people. I have come to appreciate the way people on the conservative side of American politics stood by this country, stood by its freedoms and the freedoms of people around the world in the 1950s and the 1960s, and right until the end of the Cold War. We all owe them a debt of gratitude, even though our culture continues to heap scorn on them, because the culture has been captured by the left. The left is still very, very strong, both in the media. It rules the important areas of our university culture, not the engineering departments and not the business schools, although the feminists, radical feminists, have tried to rewrite science and so forth, but they have not been that successful. But our women's studies programs, black studies, English departments, the liberal arts sectors of our university, the people who are the guardians, in a way, of our culture are pretty much, and by and large, addicted to the myths that I have tried to expose in this book. And in closing, let me just say one of the things that I've learned, why in the deepest sense I feel I am a conservative today. For me, people on the left are people, they're all children of Rousseau, and what they believe, and when I say left, I mean it in the broadest sense. It goes right through liberalism. It is the Democratic Party today. They are by and large people who believe that society is the root of all evil. If there's a criminal, society made him do it. Circumstances made him do it. If we have a problem of poverty or people are poor, that's because of society. If there's racism, it's society, and so forth. People who believe this way feel that by changing social institutions, you can usher in the millennium. You can end poverty, racism, sexism, whatever. All we need to do is change social institutions. What prevents us from doing that is people like us now, people like me, conservatives. Therefore, conservatives are truly evil, and they're something less than human. And that is why you see this demonization of people like Newt Gingrich, of movements like the Christian conservatives, a demonization, quite similar to the way communists were demonized in the 50s. The difference being that these are decent Americans who love this country, and the communists were people who hated this country and were working every day in every way for an enemy power. The left is, it's like the people in the story of the Tower of Babel who thought they could build a ladder to heaven, to build a heaven on earth. Berdyaev, the Russian philosopher, pointed out that this is a form of idolatry because it ascribes to mere mortal human beings divine powers. And that is why the left is dangerous and why it always commits great crimes when it has great power. Because it sees itself as the savior of the world and everybody in its way as standing between the way we live now and paradise. If you believe that, you can justify any crime and commit any crime. And the left has shown throughout the 20th century that it can and will do that. Conservatives believe that the problem, the social problem, is us. That it's human beings who have a capacity for good but also a capacity for evil, who have a tendency to laziness and to orneriness and to egotism and prejudice. That's why we are skeptical of what government and states can do. That's why we understand that character is more important than anything else. I am what I call an Osceola McCarty conservative. Osceola McCarty, some of you may remember, I think this was just last year, is a 75-year-old black cleaning woman who lived her life, most of it in segregated, racist Mississippi, in the poorest state in the Union, worked as a cleaning lady, and last year gave $150,000 that she had saved for scholarships at the University of Mississippi. What that should tell you, anybody who's using their common sense and not looking through ideological blinders, is that in America there is no reason to be poor. This is a land of incredible opportunity. And if you are poor, the reasons are not structural, they are characterological, they are behavioral. They have their root in individuals, perhaps in your parents, perhaps in the people around you, perhaps in a community that has been ravaged by other individuals in government who think that what's best for you is to give your teenage daughter money to have a child out of wedlock and an apartment so they can be somewhere out away from your guidance. This is the view, this is the conservative view of America. To me, it is a liberating view. It is a view that puts you at peace with the world around you, but it does not for a moment stifle your instincts for compassion or for social justice. Thank you.
We'll have several moments of questions, and then at the end, those of you who have or wish to purchase books and have David autograph them, he'd be happy to do so, and we'd be glad to sell them. Yes, of course.
What kind of a mayor would, a Los Angeles mayor would Tom Hayden make, in your opinion?
Would Tom Hayden, what kind of mayor would Tom Hayden be? Well, look, I mean, Tom Hayden, aside from not being an honest person, and honest about really important things that he has done, is also a man who's never worked an honest day in his life. He ran for office twice in California, set records for spending the most money in purchasing his seats, first as assemblyman and then a state senator. The second time, he did it with his alimony payments from his former wife, Jane Fonda. And he is campaigning against the influence of money in politics. I don't think I have to say anything more about, what you could expect. Yes.
You mentioned SDS and the Black Panthers. What do you think about the right using guerrilla theater against the left?
Guerrilla theater. I'm not clear. I kind of wish
guerrilla theater
was more capable of theater
tactics,
altogether. Pardon?
Performances at leftist events, interruptions.
Yeah, I do not believe that it is good to interrupt speakers. Dialogue is there is precious little dialogue in our culture. One side rarely hears what the other has to say. So I'm not for obstructing speakers. For demonstrations in theater, I have no objection to us. The left has greatly degraded the political process in America. We now have, for example, a Supreme Court where we have the spectacle of anytime the left disagrees with the jurisprudence of a nominee, they set out to destroy that person. And I mean destroy their character, destroy their reputation. It has no qualms. What they did first to Judge Bork and then to Clarence Thomas are probably the most disgraceful episodes in the history of American liberalism. To take an accuser, a nameless accuser, a woman who did not want to come forward, who was even the mere fact that it was an event that took place 10 years in the past and no one was present was enough that the Judiciary Committee should have said, we're not going to even listen to this testimony. That was the American way. The injustices that way does are much less compared to the ones that having faceless accusers, having people's reputations shredded by accusations which nobody can confront, and nobody can ever get at the truth at. And yet the liberal community was ready to do this to a black man who had risen from nothing to the highest position, or was on the brink of one of the highest positions in the land, is horrific. It is a horrible act. The people who conducted it, the People for the American Way and the ACLU and so forth, should be ashamed of themselves. The people who've written those atrocious books, Jane Mayer and people like that, should be ashamed of themselves. It was an act of the purest racism, in my view. I have heard, Clarence Thomas's competence challenged here and there by people who've never read an opinion that he ever wrote, who have no idea of what his thoughts are. In California, we had Governor Wilson appointed the first African-American woman Supreme Court justice in the history of the state, and the left-wing American Bar Association immediately came out and said she was incompetent. What she was conservative. And in my view, the problem we have politically today is that the conservatives are bound by some etiquette and won't say what this is. This is racism. The liberals are racist. They attack any black conservative who has the temerity and the courage to speak out will be the target of smears. Ward Connolly, who's going to be honored at a dinner that this organization is going to put on, is the target of death threats from the left. He has been linked with David Duke by the guilt by the most extremely remote associations, and that the two have the same opinion about one thing, and they try to saddle him with a sexual harassment case, which of course fell apart. So in other words, the left understands whenever there is an independent black voice, they are going to destroy this human being, either by killing him or her physically, or by destroying their reputation. And we need to respond in kind. We need to name these people for what they are. The hate mongers are on the liberal community in the Democratic Party, and it's time for conservatives to take off the kid gloves and fight.
One question from the chair, if you don't mind. Could you discuss Judge Henderson in California and how it is he came to the idea that equal opportunity is not equal opportunity?
Yes, we have a proposition in California, Proposition 209, which just clearly states, for those of you who are not in California, all it says is that government shall be prevented by the Constitution of the state of California from discriminating against any race or gender, anybody by race or gender. There shall be no government preferences of races and genders. And Thelton Henderson and the left, well, not the left, the ACLU and the NACP are arguing that that is unconstitutional. Now, think about that for a moment. It's unconstitutional not to discriminate. That either means these people are loony, which they are not, or they are no different than my parents, except 30 years later, and myself when I was a new leftist, in that they reject the Constitution of the United States, and they reject the institutions which have made this country what it is today. And they are engaged in a revolutionary movement to overturn those institutions and to institute something like a socialist state. I believe that that is the prevalent view, prevalent, mind you, dominant at Harvard Law School, at Yale Law School, at Stanford Law School, at every major law school in this country. That is what the living Constitution people are about. That is what the reinterpretation, the active judiciary is about. It is to redefine America as some quasi-socialist state in which there will be racial preferences, in which the government will sit as a god and decide who gets made equal and which group, which minority among us, since we are all minorities, gets to be privileged. And you remember what I said about idolatry. That is the idolatry. You have to think. People who advocate affirmative action preferences think the government can redress the incorrigible racism of all the rest of us. Well, who is the government? The government is people like us. So how can a racist government institute justice through racial preferences? Well, obviously it can't. It's just another form of racism. And the reason they don't see the illogic is because they are radicals and leftists in the sense that I have explored in my book Radical Son and did in my talk today. Thelton Henderson is the left-wing judge. He was on the board for years of the Michael John Institute, which is run by an old friend of mine who happens to be, or happens to have been, when I knew her, a member of the American Communist Party, on the national executive of the Lawyers Guild, Ann Fagan Ginger. You can see I'm inviting so much trouble by naming names, but it's part of, establishing the credibility and the credentials of what I say. He ought to have recused himself from this case. But we have radicals now sitting as justices on our highest courts.
In a November column, Tom Bethel said something that resonated with me, and that conservatives can't bring themselves to believe they occupy the moral high ground. And we were presented with the spectacle this week of J.C. Watts, whom I think will be the first black American president, stating that certain black leaders were race hustlers and poverty pimps, and yet Newt Gingrich launched a massive preemptive surrender by apologizing for those remarks.
Well, he didn't apologize for the remarks in particular, and I will not join in an attack on Newt Gingrich because everything that's positive in American government today, the fact that the agenda of the agenda of our government, of our Congress, and even of the president is a balanced budget and welfare reform, we owe to one man, and that man is Newt Gingrich. However, having said that, I will say that Jesse Jackson is a racial huckster, and Marion Barry is worse. Marion Barry is a man who betrayed his own constituencies. He is a drug addict and a man who has no business being the mayor of any city in America, let alone a major city like Washington, D.C. But Jackson is a man who has incited more racial hatred in our times than in any individual, perhaps with the exception of Peter Jennings and the nightly news teams. Jackson, blacks are locked out in America. That's a lie. What it says is, and all affirmative actions policies say, is white America is racist. White America actually is not racist. The myth of white racism is the most pernicious myth we have today. Even Jack Kemp will apologize for the Republicans, as though Republicans sat out the civil rights movement in some big way. Actually, the Civil Rights Acts were enacted by 90% majorities from the Republican Party and only 80 and 70% from the Democrats, because the Democrats had the Southern Democrats. They were the ones who were resisting integration. Jesse Jackson has just helped to extort $179 million from Texaco. Texaco is guilty of nothing. There was never any due process in the Texaco case. There was one tape which was completely misinterpreted that was the occasion for the extortion, a threat of a boycott, a threat to damage Texaco in the markets. And then to add fuel to this fire, Texaco then gave a 10% raise to everybody who had a dark skin. If you had a dark-hued skin at Texaco, you got a 10% raise. Had nothing to do with what you did, nothing to do with how you performed, nothing to do with you as an individual. Is there anything more un-American than this? Is there anything more racist than this? This is the new racism, and this is what we have to fight. And I would, what I hold the Republican Party accountable for is it has failed to fight this. Why in that campaign that we just had, and why not now, is the Republican Party not saying to the President in the State of the Union said, the most important thing we have to do is to build one America. Well, Mr. President, you cannot build one America if the government is dividing America by giving privileges to this minority and not that one. On what basis do they do that? That's what the Republican Party needs to say to Clinton. We won't even talk about, new education until we get clear that we have one standard in this country, one standard for judging people when they get jobs, when they get promotions, and when they get into universities or when they are promoted in universities. Got one more question. I'm sorry, we have one more question. Yeah.
You made a comment about the greater intellectual freedom and lack of ideological police on the right relative to the left. And I was just wondering whether that, even though it's appealing, whether that's made one of the things that's made the left more effective than the right, the fact that they do have those kind of ideological cops.
The ideological police. Yeah, I'm ambivalent here. I think that makes them effective. I mean, if you watch the Democrats in Congress, they have a party line. Everything the Republicans do is sort of taking food out of the mouths of the poor and giving tax breaks to the wealthy. That's their big lie. Republicans talk with 100 heads. I think in parties you need to have a party line, if you will. I think in society that's totalitarianism. One of the things I love about the conservative movement is that it is so diverse, so unorthodox, so at loggerheads. So I take some of the painful moments when I see conservatives attacking each other. I think is very healthy. So I remain ambivalent on that. I just think it's important for everybody in America to understand that there is a great struggle for the soul of this country, and to get on the right side.
Thank you, David. If you'd like to pick up your book, they're behind us, and if you'd like to, if you've already reserved one, just tell us your name, we'll hand it over, and we'll get you a pen.